Okay, so welcome to another episode of Art Source, and here we are actually going to do measurements, how to take measurements from live objects whenever you are drawing or painting from life or observation, and how to use a straight edge or a measurement on the fly rather than, specific calculated measurements. So I have some household bottles and objects set up here, and this setup is fairly simple. If you want to create it at home, it's just a 99-cent piece of foam board and then a simple $1.99 trifold. And then I have this lighting, this clip-on lighting, which is just a basic it's a clamp lamp, and it's the 6-foot cable 18 gauge light. I just got this one from Ace Hardware, and you can use warm or cool lighting, meaning that the light bulb that you use can have like a yellow cast or a blue cast depending on what you're going for. I don't really care in this one. I just wanted some directional lighting, so I just clamped it to the top of the trifold board there. So I'm going to get my phone clamped in here to the phone holder that I have so that you are actually looking through my eyes right now. You see exactly what I see. So we're going to talk through these measurements together. Now, whenever you are drawing or painting from observation rather than a photograph or a printout, you are dealing with the first disadvantage of how do I contain my objects, meaning that you, the viewer right now of this video, have the advantage of looking through my phone, which is containing everything in a box. So you don't have to think about the framework of how you would fit this on a canvas. But if you were looking at it totally through my eyes, you would have the perimeter where, how do I possibly, box this or package it so that it fits on the canvas. So the same strategy would apply if you were trying to do plein air painting for the first time, etc., where you're simply means that you're painting outdoors, and it's like, well, how do I frame the work? How do I get a containment so that I can even get started? So you can take any standard straight edge, being a paintbrush or a pen or a pencil, it doesn't really matter. And in the first 10 to 15 seconds, whenever you're doing figure drawing, item drawing, plein air drawing, whatever, you want to try and establish the boundaries of your objects. And what I mean by that is what I'm calling the north, south, east, and west boundaries. And so when I'm doing that, you want to kind of look at the negative space. Now let's just take the frame of the camera right now. So you are looking at the whole framework here, and negative space is anything that doesn't hold solid mass or objects. So this space here is what I'm calling negative space. This space here is what I'm calling negative space. And then this space here is what I'm calling negative space. So when you're considering these objects, you want to try and set up boundaries so that you can tighten it up. So for example, if I were actually working on a blank canvas, I probably would not want to have a lot of negative space on the bottom here. It just doesn't make sense because it's not the spotlight. So I would probably stop my image about right here. So that's just enough negative space to kind of keep it interesting and keep the focus on the actual objects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my east boundary first. It doesn't really matter which one you start with, but I'm just going to take my straight edge, in this case the paintbrush, and I'm going to move it until it actually hits something. So I'm going closer, closer, warmer, warmer, boom, there we go. So my object is right here, and that's where I finally stop, and that is going to be what I'm calling my east boundary. Okay, and then there is the north right there at the top. See, boom, right there. And then here is my west boundary right here, so I keep going till I stop. And then I've got my south boundary, which is there, right? This is a little bit higher than there, so I'm going to stop there. And then I've got my boundaries set up. Now I'll show you in a separate video how to apply it to paper because I don't want to switch views here, but that's how I'd set up my north, south, east, west boundary. And so now you can take the south boundary, for example, when it hits here, and you can come up with an angle. I can tilt the brush so that it hits the second physical object here, and now I have an angle, a diagonal angle that I can use as a measurement. So I can hold my hand out straight, and I've got this angle, and then I can move it over to my paper and use that same angle to measure with. So I can do the same thing here. So I'm going to put my brush until I hit the physical top of this, and then I'll hit the physical top of this, and I've got another angle that I can measure. And then the same thing here, I'll hit here, and here, and I've got another angle I can measure, and another angle I can measure, and another angle I can measure, you know. So you've got all these different angles that you can use, and you measure them and you move them over to your paper to compare, keeping your hand still so that you maintain the same angles. I hope that makes sense for you. And then the next way that you can measure is that you can actually go with the whole process of how many of this object is in this object. And what I mean by that is I'm going to take the end of the brush here, and let's just take this object here. So I'm going to take the end of the brush and I'm going to move it until it hits the top of the object. And so I see that stopping right here. And then I'm going to slide my finger until I can mark the end of that object. So you see that this segment represents, to the best of my ability, the distance of this object. They are the same, and I'm using this as a marker. And while I'm marking this, you see it's the total height of this object. I'm going to move it around to see, are they the same size? No, they're not. Is there two of these in this? No, there's not, but it is close. But what I notice is when I'm holding my hand still like that, is it not true that if I start right here below this object, then yes, there is two of those. Do you see? It goes from here to here, and then it goes from here to here. So if we go to our algebraic equation, if I stop here right below the lip of the glass, right there, then that segment down to the end of the object, right there, I'm going to mark it, and that becomes segment X. So that's 1X. And then there is 2X. So from the bottom of here to the top of here is what we're calling 2X. Does that make sense? Look. 1, 2. And then when you're measuring on your paper, it's not that you would physically take this whole measurement, because my paper is probably not this big. But it doesn't matter. You're comparing apples to apples, and then on your paper you're comparing probably oranges to oranges. It's probably smaller. And you'll need to watch the other video if you're confused about that a little bit. But all that we need to know is that I just measured that, and there's 1, and then there's 2, right? Now you might be asking, well look, you didn't account for that little gap because the bottom of here is higher than that. Why didn't you do that? Because it doesn't matter. You're just trying to find comparisons. Where else could I find this measurement? And so I'll look all around trying to find what I'm going to call vertical measurements, which means that I'm holding the brush or the pencil or whatever upright and I'm taking vertical measurements. But I can also take horizontal measurements. So here is my constant, which is X. There's that shape. Now I can try and find it, you know, vertically, and I've already established there it is there. But where else is it, and can I look horizontally? So I've still got the same mark, and I'm just trying to find it wherever it is. And I'll say, okay, it's not quite the distance between there and there, but I'm just going to move it around until I find it, if I can even find it. And I could say, well, you know, maybe the end of here and the end of here, maybe that's X there, right? You know, I mean, who cares as long as you're measuring around and trying to find it. And sometimes you might not get exact. I mean, usually in nature there are some exact, and wherever you're finding it, you'll find these natural, natural exact measurements. But you know, you always want to feel it around. So let's ditch this and let's replace it with something smaller. So we have another measurement now. So I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to measure the length of that. And I'll say, okay, look, from the top, right, I'm going to move the brush until it hits the top. Boom. And then I'm going to adjust my finger to mark the bottom. Boom. And then I'll say, okay, look, that becomes X. That segment becomes X. And it is the same vertically as it is horizontally. So it becomes 1X that way, and it also becomes 1X that way. And then I can say, oh, look, you know, is it the same? No, it's a little bit, this is a little bit wider, perhaps. Let's check it out. So there's the width, and there's the width of that. Look, they're exactly the same. So now I have something to measure it to, right? And so if I slide my finger, is that the correct measurement? No, because there's all this surplus brush. So I need to slide my hand until I get exact measurement, and then there's exact measurement. And so when I'm doing my drawing, I can compare the paper, and even if my drawing is minuscule and super tiny, I might measure that. And if on my drawing the bottle is that wide, well then this bottle needs to be that wide too, correct? So those are the kind of guidelines that I'm looking for. And then if the object was smaller, then the angle here is going to change, correct? Because by the time I hit this and hit this, I've got a different angle to measure by, right? So that's something to consider. And the more objects that you place in, the more that you have to work with, to where I can say, okay, well, there's the perimeter or the top of that glass, and there's the top of that bottle. So now there's a new angle. And then, I can still do that angle, or I can do that angle. Or now my south perimeter has changed, right? Because this is now the lowest mark if I'm going up from my negative space. So I hope that makes sense, but that's how you can use your brush to either, come up with straight edge angles, or you can say how many of this is in this. And it is pretty perplexing. I mean, it takes a long time to really get a clear concept of measurements and trying to find it. And like I said, it's not always going to be exact, but you can do ballparks and say, well, how many of these glass items are in this glass item? Well, let's find out. Let's see, there's one, right? And then I'm actually going to start from the bottom here, even though we didn't before, but there's 1, 2, and that little bit of extra. So I say, okay, and what I physically just did, and let's just make it super easy. I'm going to take all of this stuff out of the way. And then I'm saying, how many of these physically exist in this? And so I measured it, and I said, okay, there's physically 1. There's physically 1. And then I started right where I left off, right there. There's 1. There's 2. And there's what, like a half? 2.5? Okay, so there you go. Or maybe, it would have been a little bit taller item where you say, okay, it is, let's see, 1. There's 1. There's 2. And not quite a half, right? Like maybe 2 3/4. Or maybe it's an even taller item where you're saying, okay, let's see what this is. There's 1. And let's see, 1 1/4 maybe, or 1 2/4. So you just decide like how much of that's there. All I need to know is that it's more than halfway up. So at least if I can start guesstimating, I have like a ballpark. It's not always going to be exact, but at least I can come up with some kind of measurements when I'm working on my drawing. So I hope that's helped. Please watch the next video also about how to translate it to a paper or drawing or painting. But of course I can't look at both views at one time, but the other video will help out. But this actually gives you a bird's eye view so that you can see exactly what I'm seeing, because if I was teaching this in a class setting, I can talk about it, but my view of it and your view of it are going to be 2 different measurements, so we couldn't possibly get the same thing. But I hope this helped, and please check out another episode of Art Source.